Hey guys, welcome back to the Pre-Calculus 20 videos. In this video, we're going to look at lesson 3 from chapter 3, which is talking about completing the square. So when we want to change a quadratic equation given in standard form but wanted in vertex form, we use a process called completing the square. And just as a quick note, if we wanted to change a quadratic equation given in vertex form, all we have to do is expand and simplify it using BEDMAS. So with completing the square, there are 4 to 5 steps that we must follow. So step number 1. Here we're going to group the first two terms together, which is your x squared and your x term. If the x squared term has a coefficient a, we need to pull out that common factor of that a value from both your x squared and x term. So essentially, we don't want that x squared term to have a coefficient. Then what we do is, then we'd add and subtract the square of half of the coefficient of the x term to create a perfect square trinomial. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to take that b value, we're going to cut it in half, and then we're going to square that value. And then what you do is you're going to group the perfect square trinomial just by inserting brackets into your equation. Then we're going to rewrite that equation using the square of a binomial, and then all that we're going to do is simplify after that. So let's put these 5 steps to practice. So this here is example number 1 from your notes. And here what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite the function vertex form by completing the square. So here our function is y is equal to x squared minus 8x plus 13. Now according to our first step says to group together the first two terms and to pull out that common factor of a if it exists. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our first two terms, so we have x squared and negative 8x. If this wasn't in going from highest exponent to lowest exponent, you would want to reorder it first. But in this case, we're good to go. So we're going to look at x squared minus 8x. And we don't actually need to factor anything out because this doesn't have a value in front of it, or it's just 1. So all that we have to do is we're just going to put brackets in between or on the outside of those two terms to separate it from that 13. Then our next step says to add and then subtract the square of half of the coefficient of the x term to create a perfect square trinomial. So essentially all that we're going to do is we take a look at that b value. So here we have negative 8. So we're going to cut that in half. So negative 8 divided by 2 is equal to negative 4. And then what we're going to do is then we square it. So square negative 4, and what we should get is 16. So what we do with that is we're going to write that inside of our brackets. So we have y is equal to x squared minus 8x. And it says to add and then subtract. So we add 16 and then subtract 16, and then write 13 on the outside there. Our next step there says to group the perfect square trinomial. And so essentially what we're going to do is our perfect square trinomial is our first 3 terms here. So x squared minus 8x plus 16. And so what we have to do is we have to bring this 16 on the other side of the brackets. When there's no a value here, we can simply just move it to the other side without having to do any other extra calculations. So we have y is equal to, so we have x squared minus 8x plus 16. Then we'll move that negative 16 to the other side. And we don't have to change the value here because it's just the other side of the brackets, not the other side of the equation. So we can simply just write negative 16 on that other side. Then what we can do is we can actually clean up this negative 16 plus 13. So we have y is equal to x squared minus 8x plus 16. Then negative 16 plus 13 would leave you with negative 3. So according to our next step, now we need to rewrite using the square of a binomial. And so in order to rewrite using the square of a binomial, what we have to do is we have to factor. So we're going to factor using that product sum method that you guys had learned in Foundations in Pre-Calculus 10. So we're looking at the product. You take your first term multiply it with the coefficient of your last term. So you have 1 times 16. So we want to find a number that will multiply to 16 and has a sum of the b value, which is -8. And so one thing that's really important about when we're completing the square is that you're always going to look for a number that basically, if you multiply it with itself, will give you 16, and then when you add it with itself, will give you -8. So you should never have two different numbers when completing the square, because if you had that, then that means you made an error. So we're looking for a number that when you multiply it gives you 16, adds to -8. That would be -4 and -4. So what we can do is we can rewrite that middle term there. We have y is equal to x squared minus 4x minus 4x. So rewrite the middle term with those two coefficients plus 16, and then on the outside you had -3. So our next step when we are factoring is that we want to pull out like terms from our first set of terms and from the second set of terms. And when we're trying to figure out what to pull out, we always want to make sure that whatever's left over inside those brackets is they're the exact same binomial. Okay, so we have y is equal to, so looking at x squared minus 4x, the common factor there, or the common term there would be an x value, and you're left with x minus 4. In our second set, we have a 4 in common, but remember we want this x value to be the same, so we want to pull out a negative to make it positive. So pull out a -4, and what we should get is x minus 4 left over, and then make sure to bring down that -3. It's very easy to forget that -3, so make sure you keep bringing it down. Then what we can do is we can combine those like terms again, so or pull out a common factor of x minus 4. So pull out an x minus 4, what you're left with is x minus 4. And make sure to bring down that subtract 3. So then our last step is basically to look at the definition of what a square is. So remember, a square is essentially a number multiplying by itself. And looking here at our two binomials, we have a binomial multiplying by itself, which means that we can write it as a square. So we have x minus 4 squared minus 3. And now we have our equation in vertex form. And just for those who, if you guys really don't like that factoring method, now that I've shown you how to factor, now I'm going to show you a cheat sheet method for completing the square. So suppose we want to bypass all of this work right here. Once when you get up to our factoring step, I'm going to show you what to do with our equation at this point here. That will basically be a shortcut to factoring. All right, so let's look at that shortcut. So suppose we were at that point where we had x squared minus 8x plus 16, and then subtract 3 on the outside of those brackets. So here's that shortcut method. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the square root of your first term. So square root x squared, you should get x. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take the square root of your last term. So square root of 16 is 4. Then we're going to basically rewrite this entire trinomial here. So you're going to write two brackets with a square outside. And this x value is your first term. This 4 is your last term. And then to determine whether or not it's positive or negative or adding or subtracting 4, you just use the symbol that is right here in the middle. So bring that on down. So we get x minus 4 squared, and then make sure to bring down that subtract 3. And there you have bypassed all of that factoring. Okay, so go back, look at your answer. In the above part we had x minus 4 squared minus 3, and down here we have x minus 4 squared minus 3. So you get the exact same answer. Just this way, it probably saves you at least maybe about 2 minutes in completing your work, or maybe if you've mastered factoring, still remember it from grade 10, then maybe you only save yourself about 30 seconds. But still, it's a little bit of a faster way. But if you're not comfortable with it, go ahead and use that factoring method. I'm okay with whichever method you guys choose. Just know yourselves and just make sure it works for you. So that is everything in this video. So thank you guys so much for watching. And if you guys have any questions, make sure to come see me in class or just text me on Remind 101.